In the towering shadow of the Andes, where clouds cling to mountainsides and villages cling to survival, people have always whispered about spirits and demons that wander the valleys. But between the 1960s and 1980s, the people of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru discovered a demon not born of legend but of flesh and blood. His name was Pedro Alonso Lopez, and the world would come to know him as El Monstruo de los Andes, the monster of the Andes. He confessed to murdering more than 300 girls, and though the true number may never be confirmed, investigators who dug shallow graves across the Andes believe it is not exaggeration. His crimes, chilling in scale and cruelty, make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Yet unlike Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or André Chikatilo, Lopez remains a shadowy name outside of South America. Perhaps because his victims were the poorest of the poor, young girls who sold flowers or candies in rural markets. Girls no one bothered to search for when they disappeared. Their invisibility allowed him to kill again and again, and their silence became the shroud that hid him for more than a decade. Pedro was born in October 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, into violence and despair. His father, a guerrilla fighter, was killed before Pedro was born. His mother, a prostitute, raised 13 children in poverty, beating them, neglecting them, ruling with cruelty. Pedro was her least favorite, a boy she saw as weak. When he was 8 years old, she caught him touching his younger sister inappropriately. Furious, she threw him out of the house. From that day, Pedro was alone. Bogotá's streets in the 1950s were teeming with homeless children, thousands of them begging, stealing, selling their bodies. Pedro quickly learned what it meant to be prey. He later said he was taken in by a man who promised him shelter, only to repeatedly abuse him. That betrayal twisted something inside him, planting seeds of rage and darkness that would grow unchecked. As a teenager, he drifted through gangs of other abandoned children, stealing to survive, toughening himself against constant hunger and danger. At 18, he stole a car and was arrested. In prison, he was gang raped by fellow inmates, another violation that deepened his hatred. But this time, he struck back. He fashioned a crude knife and attacked 3 of his abusers, killing them. The authorities, rather than punishing him, accepted it as self-defense. In that moment, Pedro learned the intoxicating power of violence. To kill was to take back control. To kill was to be feared. It was a lesson he would carry into the world outside prison walls. By the early 1970s, Lopez was wandering through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, drifting like a ghost. He had no home, no roots, no one to care for him. What he did have was compulsion. He began targeting girls between the ages of 8 and 12, children who reminded him perhaps of his own stolen innocence, but whom he now saw as easy prey. His hunting grounds were the bustling markets of small towns, places where poor children sold trinkets, shined shoes, or begged for coins. To them, he seemed like a kind stranger. He would offer candy, toys, or the promise of food, and when the child agreed to follow him, he would lead her away, down dirt roads, into valleys, into fields where no one could hear her screams. There, he would strangle her, often at sunrise, confessing later that he liked to watch the light fade from her eyes. He buried some in shallow graves, others he left to the wind and earth. He spoke of these killings later with chilling calm, as though describing chores. At the height of his spree, Lopez claimed he killed 2 or 3 children a week. The number seems impossible, yet the evidence unearthed supports it. In the 1970s, South America was fertile ground for predators. Colombia was torn by civil war and the rise of cartels. Ecuador and Peru were mired in poverty and political unrest. Missing children reports were rarely taken seriously. Police forces were underfunded, corrupt, and overwhelmed. Indigenous and rural families were invisible to governments. Into this chaos walked Pedro Lopez, and the silence around him became his cloak. There were moments when fate might have stopped him. In Peru, an indigenous tribe caught him attempting to abduct a girl. They tied him up, preparing to execute him. But an American missionary intervened, persuading them to hand him over to police. Incredibly, the police released him. He walked free, and the killings continued. Later investigators would say that moment alone may have cost dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. By the late 1970s, whispers spread through Ecuador. Mothers warned daughters not to speak to strangers. Vendors at markets kept a wary eye on unfamiliar men. In Ambato, a town nestled in the mountains, heavy rains in 1979 caused a flash flood. The flood unearthed a mass grave where the bodies of several missing girls lay. Panic swept the town. The whispers of a demon became shouts of fear. The people demanded action. It was in Ambato's market that Lopez's reign finally faltered. A vendor noticed a tall, gaunt man attempting to coax a girl away with a toy. The townspeople surrounded him, beat him, nearly killed him. Police intervened, arresting him. In custody, at first, Lopez denied everything, but under pressure, he began to confess. He spoke with chilling detachment of hundreds of murders. He described how he lured the girls, how he strangled them, how he watched them die. He led police to grave sites where dozens of tiny bodies were found. His words were almost unbelievable, but the evidence supported them. He claimed over 300 victims across 3 countries. For investigators, it was a nightmare beyond comprehension. In 1980, he was charged in Ecuador with 110 murders. The trial shocked the nation. Families wept as they heard details of their daughter's last moments. The press called him the monster of the Andes, and the name stuck. But the punishment was grotesquely inadequate. At that time, Ecuador's maximum sentence was 16 years. For the murder of more than 100 children, Pedro Lopez would serve just 16 years. He served 14, released in 1994 for good behavior. He was deported to Colombia, briefly imprisoned, then declared insane and confined to a psychiatric hospital. In 2002, he was released on bail. After that, he vanished. What became of him is unknown. Some reports suggest he was rearrested for another killing. Others say he slipped back into obscurity, perhaps continuing to kill, perhaps dying in anonymity. His fate remains a mystery. What is certain is the devastation he left behind. If his confession was true, Pedro Lopez killed more children than any other serial killer in recorded history. Yet unlike infamous Western killers, his name is rarely remembered, perhaps because his victims were poor, indigenous girls. Perhaps because the world did not care to remember them. His story is not only about one man's evil, but about the failures that allowed him to exist. He thrived because his victims were invisible, because the police were careless, because societies abandoned their children. He thrived because silence is fertile ground for monsters. Every girl he killed had a name, a face, a dream. They were not numbers. They were daughters, sisters, students, children who deserved to grow. Instead, they were taken, buried in the cold soil of the Andes, their voices forever silenced. And so we are left with haunting questions. Did he truly kill 300? Did he continue after his release? Is he alive today, an old man with blood on his conscience? Or did he vanish into the mountains, leaving only ghosts behind? The Andes are vast, and they keep their secrets. Perhaps we will never know. But the story of Pedro Lopez demands to be told. Not to glorify him, but to remember his victims, to acknowledge the failures that allowed him to hunt, and to remind us that monsters are not confined to myths. Sometimes they are men, ordinary in appearance, blending into crowds, who carry death in their pockets and smile as they lure children away. Sometimes they walk unnoticed until silence gives them permission to kill again and again. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes, remains one of history's darkest figures. His crimes are a scar on Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, a wound that never healed. And as long as his fate remains uncertain, his shadow lingers across the mountains where the wind carries the whispers of the girls he silenced. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Crimson Narratives for more haunting journeys into the darkest corners of human history. Because only by remembering can we honor the victims, and only by telling these stories can we hope to recognize the shadows that still walk among us.